There is a man in Seoul that business executives schedule reroutes to avoid. Not because he is loud. Not because he broadcasts his power with gold watches and armed motorcades and the kind of theatrical menace that lesser men perform to feel significant. Not because of any of that. Because he doesn't need to. Because when Kwon Hyuk walks into a room, the room reorganizes itself around him. Not by order. Not by instruction. By instinct. The ancient, survival-wired part of the human brain, the part that kept your ancestors alive on the savannah, quietly fires a single message to every conscious mind in the vicinity: be careful. The air doesn't just shift when he enters. It submits. He is 34 years old. He has controlled the Kwon Syndicate, Seoul's most quietly devastating criminal organization, since he was 28, when he dismantled a rival network of 200 men using nothing but a restructured debt ledger and 17 days of pointed silence. No gunfire. No public spectacle. He simply made the organization cease to be profitable, and then he waited. They collapsed like a building whose foundation had been removed while everyone was still living inside. They called it a hostile takeover in the financial papers. His men called it something else entirely. He once sat across from a Hong Kong Triad representative at a negotiation table in a private dining room on the 47th floor of a Gangnam tower, 12 men on the other side, lawyers, bodyguards, a translator, the works. The representative opened with a number Hyuk found insulting. Hyuk didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean forward. He didn't even blink at a rate that could be described as human. He simply looked at the men. For 4 minutes and 11 seconds, according to the timestamp on the security footage. The representative signed the revised contract, excused himself to the restroom, and was heard crying quietly through the door. He flew back to Hong Kong that same night, 2 hours ahead of schedule, and reportedly never spoke Hyuk's name again, not even to deny he knew him. That is the kind of man we are talking about. His inner circle, 12 men who have collectively survived more violence than most military units, do not simply follow him. They study him. They track his patterns with the quiet, reverent attention of people who aren't entirely certain their employer operates by normal human rules. There is, in fact, a private running list, not officially sanctioned, but very much real, kept by his second-in-command, Min Jae, of every instance in which Hyuk achieved something catastrophic using nothing but his physical stillness. That list currently has 23 entries. We'll come back to entry number 17. It involves a single raised eyebrow and a collapsed import operation. The point, the entire point, is this. Kwon Hyuk is the most controlled, most precisely constructed, most psychologically fortified human being operating in Seoul's underworld. Possibly in Seoul itself. Possibly in the entire country. A man engineered by circumstance and sharpened by consequence into something that functions more like a force of nature than a person. His silence is his empire. His stillness is his weapon. His composure is the thing that built everything he owns. And then, on an otherwise ordinary Wednesday morning, a 27-year-old from Brooklyn, New York, carrying a silver service tray, a steaming cup of green tea, and an attitude that had absolutely no business being within 500 meters of this man, rounded the corner of his private penthouse hallway. Before I go any further, if this is already the kind of story that has you sitting up straighter, you are exactly where you belong. Welcome to Mafia Moonlight Tales. Hit that like button right now, subscribe if you haven't already, drop a comment telling me you're here, and share this with someone who needs a story tonight. Now, let's go back to the hallway. Her name is Seraphina. Everyone who matters to her calls her Phi. She is 27, she is from Brooklyn, she has braids that fall past her shoulders, a smile that arrives slightly ahead of her words, and an expression, calm, unhurried, carrying a knowing warmth, that suggests she has met every version of intimidating the world has to offer and found it, on the whole, manageable. She is not naive. Understand that clearly. Phi is not a woman who missed the memo about where she was working or who she was working for. She had read the brief. She had heard the name. She knew the building she walked into every morning had a different set of rules than the rest of the city. She simply did not find those rules applicable to her, personally. This is a crucial distinction. She is a high-end hospitality specialist, the kind brought in for private residences where discretion is not a preference but a contractual obligation. She had worked for a reclusive tech billionaire in Singapore. She had managed the private household of a Saudi prince's nephew in Paris for 8 months without incident. She had served tea to men who moved the world quietly and had never once found it necessary to be afraid of them. She treated power the way she treated difficult weather, noted, respected, dressed for accordingly, and then moved through without drama. She was not supposed to be in that particular corridor at that particular time. She had taken a wrong turn looking for the service elevator. Kwon Hyuk came around the corner first. He was mid-stride, that precise, unhurried pace his men had privately catalogued as pre-decision walking, meaning he was en route to doing something that would rearrange several people's lives. His black suit was cut to a precision that had nothing to do with fashion and everything to do with authority. The neck tattoo, a detail that journalists had speculated about for years without getting close enough to confirm, was just visible above his collar. 4 bodyguards flanked him at regulation distance, silent as furniture. He looked, as he always looked, like a man who had not been surprised since approximately 2019. Phi came around the corner second. Silver tray. White porcelain cup. Steam rising in a thin, elegant column. Her apron crisp. Her braids over one shoulder. And on her face, that expression. Unhurried. Warm. The smile of someone who sees you, not the version of you that you've been presenting to the world. She did not stop walking immediately. She slowed. She looked up at him, this 6-foot-plus man whose stillness had made grown men weep, and she tilted her head, the way you do when you notice someone carrying something heavy that they didn't need to be carrying. And she said, with the easy, unshakable warmth of a woman who had been raised to speak truth to every soul she encountered regardless of title or terror. Easy there, honey, you look like you've got the weight of the whole world sitting on those pretty shoulders. Then she extended the tray toward him. Helpful. Sincere. Completely unbothered. Kwon Hyuk stopped. Not like a man who had been physically obstructed. Like a man whose internal operating system had been handed a file it did not have the software to open. His stride, that stride his men had documented, simply ceased. His expression did not shift into anger. It did not shift into anything recognizable. It went somewhere unprecedented, processing. He opened his mouth. What came out was, how. His right-hand man, Min Jae, standing 2 steps behind him, would later describe the following 10 minutes as the single most destabilizing professional experience of my career, including the Rotterdam situation, and I maintain that assessment. One bodyguard kept his face perfectly neutral through what appeared to be extraordinary personal cost. Another one, in the privacy of his own mind, quietly began reconsidering his career trajectory. A third briefly wondered if he was legally obligated to report a medical episode to someone. The Glacial King. The man whose silence had dismantled syndicates. The man with 23 entries on a private list of psychological warfare achievements. Standing in his own hallway. Attempting the word how with the structural difficulty of someone trying to pronounce a foreign language they had never once encountered. For 10 minutes. Phi waited. Not impatiently. Not with amusement that had any meanness in it. She simply waited, the way you wait for someone to find what they're looking for, present, unhurried, giving him all the time in the world. When he finally managed nothing further, she offered a small, kind nod. It's all right, take your time, set the tea on the narrow hallway console table beside him, and said, it'll be there when you're ready for it. Then she turned, found the correct corridor, and went back to work. That was the beginning. That was the morning the most feared men in Korea met the only person on the peninsula who had absolutely no idea she was supposed to be afraid of him, and didn't especially care to be informed. That was the Tuesday that cracked the glacier. And everything that followed, the stuttering, the soul food in the syndicate kitchen, the skincare ambush, the boardroom breach, the betting pool his men absolutely deny exists, and the 3 words that took him longer to say than it took him to build his entire empire, all of it started here. In a white marble hallway. With a cup of green tea. And 1 word. Honey. Seraphina Josephine Carter did not move to Seoul because she was running from something. That distinction mattered to her. Deeply. She had watched enough people in her life make decisions powered by fear, packing up and relocating their whole existence to outrun a feeling, a person, a version of themselves they didn't like, and she had decided early that she would never be that woman. Every move she made would be towards something. Intentional. Chosen. Hers. So when the contract came through, private hospitality specialist, 12-month placement, high-net-worth residential client in Gangnam, Seoul. She read it twice, researched the city for 4 days straight, called her grandmother in Crown Heights to talk it through, and then signed it on a Thursday evening with a cup of chamomile tea and zero hesitation. She was 27 years old. She had a carry-on, 2 checked bags, her grandmother's cast-iron skillet wrapped in a hoodie at the bottom of the larger one, and an attitude that had been carefully constructed over a lifetime of being underestimated and repeatedly, quietly proving people wrong. Brooklyn had built her. Not softly. Brooklyn built people the way rivers shape rock, persistently, without apology, until what's left is something that cannot be easily moved. She had grown up the eldest of 4 in a household where her mother worked double shifts at a hospital and her grandmother ran the apartment like a small, loving military operation. Phi had learned early that warmth and firmness were not opposites. That you could care for someone genuinely, completely, and still not flinch when they tried to intimidate you. Her grandmother had raised 5 children, buried a husband, and once talked a belligerent landlord down from an eviction attempt using nothing but eye contact and a very long silence. Phi had studied that woman like a textbook. She arrived in Seoul in March, when the city was still carrying the last cold edge of winter. She found it beautiful in the way that serious things are beautiful, structured, precise, demanding a certain quality of attention. She picked up conversational Korean faster than her language app expected. She learned the subway within a week. She made friends with a woman at the rice cake stall near her apartment building by the end of the 2nd week, because Phi had never once in her life been in a place without finding the person worth knowing. She had been briefed on the client, naturally. The agency was thorough if nothing else. High profile. Private. Expect minimal interaction. Follow protocols. Do not initiate conversation. There were additional notes written in the careful, slightly anxious language of people who wanted to communicate something serious without committing it directly to paper. Phi read it all. Understood it all. Filed it appropriately. The thing was, and this was not recklessness, not ignorance, not a failure to grasp the situation, Phi had a policy. She extended basic human warmth to every person she encountered until they gave her a specific, concrete reason not to. A reputation was not a reason. Other people's fear was not a reason. A file of careful, anxious professional language was not a reason. She had met cold men before. Men who used silence like a wall, whose faces had been arranged for so long into expressions of authority that they'd forgotten there was something underneath. She didn't find them frightening. She found them, if she was honest, a little bit sad. Like houses with all the curtains drawn on a perfectly good afternoon. She knew, walking into that penthouse on her first official morning, exactly the kind of building she was entering. She simply believed, with the quiet, unshakable certainty of a woman raised by someone who could stare down a landlord without blinking, that every curtain could be opened. She just needed to find the right window. She didn't expect to find it in a hallway, on a Wednesday, before she'd even located the service elevator. But Phi had always been adaptable. The kitchen was an architectural insult. That was Phi's professional assessment, formed within 45 seconds of stepping inside it on her 3rd morning at the penthouse. She stood in the doorway and took a slow inventory with the expression of a woman who had been personally wronged by an interior design decision. The space was enormous. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Imported marble countertops in a white so aggressively clean it was nearly aggressive. Equipment that cost more than most people's cars, arranged with the precise, untouched stillness of a showroom. Every appliance gleamed. Every surface reflected light without warmth. There were no smells. None. A kitchen that had never once been asked to do the thing a kitchen existed to do. She opened the refrigerator. Protein shakes. 7 of them, identical, lined up with the military precision of men who had been told exactly where to stand. A container of pre-cut fruit that had given up hope. 2 bottles of still water. 1 single, solitary apple that looked like it had been placed there by someone who had read about fruit but never eaten any. Phi closed the refrigerator. She stood very still for a moment in the way her grandmother did when she was deciding how much of a situation she was going to personally fix. Then she took out her phone and started writing a grocery list. Nobody stopped her from going to the market. This was, in retrospect, the first tactical error the syndicate made in their entire association with Seraphina Carter. They had protocols for weapons, for surveillance, for personnel movement. Nobody had written a protocol for a hospitality employee with a reusable tote bag and strong opinions about dried spices. She came back with 4 bags, a bunch of fresh thyme that she held like a small bouquet, and the cast iron skillet she had brought from Brooklyn, retrieved from her apartment specifically for this purpose, because she had taken one look at the pans hanging in that kitchen and decided they were decorative objects, not tools. She cooked the way her mother had taught her and her grandmother had perfected, without measuring, without hesitation, with the full, unhurried confidence of someone who had been feeding people their whole life and understood it as a form of love that required no explanation. She started with rice. Then chicken, seasoned in a way that the building had never once encountered. Then greens. Then something slow and rich on the back burner that began filling the penthouse with a smell that had absolutely no business being in a criminal empire and yet fit there, somehow, like a truth nobody had known they were missing. The first guard appeared in the kitchen doorway at the 11-minute mark. He was one of the larger ones, stationed at the East Corridor, a man who had held that post for 2 years with the dedication of someone who had decided that stillness was a personality. He stood at the entrance to the kitchen with his arms crossed and his face arranged carefully into an expression of professional neutrality. His eyes went directly to the stove. Phi glanced over her shoulder. "You can sit down," she said. "It won't be ready for another 20 minutes, but you're welcome to wait." He did not sit down immediately. He deliberated for approximately 4 seconds, which, for a man of his particular training, was essentially a complete emotional spiral, and then pulled out the nearest stool. A second guard arrived at minute 14. A third at minute 19. By the time the food was plated, there were 5 of them arranged around the kitchen island in varying postures of men trying to appear like they had ended up there by coincidence. Phi served them without ceremony, the way you feed family, plate down, no performance, the implicit message being simply, eat. Nobody spoke. They didn't need to. The kitchen, for the first time in its expensive, sterile existence, smelled like a home. It started, as most catastrophically bad ideas do, with one man finding something funnier than he was professionally permitted to acknowledge. Min Jae had served Kwon Hyuk for 6 years. He had been present for negotiations that rewrote the financial geography of 3 criminal organizations. He had stood in rooms where the temperature dropped not because of weather but because of the specific quality of his employer's attention. He had watched Hyuk dismantle men twice his age using nothing but silence and a particular way of setting down a glass. In 6 years, Min Jae had seen his boss operate with a consistency of composure that bordered on the supernatural. He had never, in 6 years, seen the men stutter. Then Phi arrived. And in the space of 72 hours, Min Jae's entire professional framework required revision. It happened the second time on a Friday morning. Hyuk was delivering operational instructions to a small group in the main corridor, precise, low-voiced, the kind of address that made men write things down so they wouldn't have to ask twice. Phi came through on her way to the linen cupboard, braids over one shoulder, humming something quietly under her breath. She passed the group, caught Hyuk's eye, and said, without breaking stride, "Morning, honey. Don't forget you have that thing at 11. She rounded the corner. Hyuk turned back to his men. "The transfer window for the Incheon AC, the account will be." He stopped. Reset. Tried again. Got as far as AC twice more before completing the sentence on the 4th attempt, with the careful concentration of a man defusing something. His men stared at the middle distance with the synchronized, glassy focus of people pretending they were somewhere else entirely. Min Jae wrote a small number 2 in the margin of his notepad. He told himself it was administrative. Relevant data. A professional observation, nothing more. By the following Wednesday, he had a dedicated page. By Friday, the page had a column system. He had not intended to show anyone. That was genuinely true. But Sung-ho, the guard who had been first to the kitchen that day, a man not known for his conversational warmth, had spotted the tally over his shoulder while Min Jae was updating it after an incident involving Phi, a broken blind in the east sitting room, and the phrase, "Sugar, hand me that chair," which had produced a stutter of such architectural complexity that Hyuk had eventually abandoned the sentence, straightened his jacket, and left the room at a pace that was technically dignified. Sung-ho looked at the tally. Looked at Min Jae. Said nothing for a long moment. Then, put me down for 11 this week. The pool had 7 participants by the weekend. They were, to a man, deeply committed professionals with combined records of service that spanned decades. They ran the betting operation with the same precision they applied to everything else: structured entry, documented predictions, dispute resolution handled by silent consensus. They used a locked notes application. They had a group chat name that none of them would ever repeat to another living soul. The current record was 9 in a single day. Set on the Thursday, Phi reorganized the hallway console table and asked Hyuk, pleasantly and directly, whether he owned anything with color in it or if black was a whole personality commitment. He had attempted a response 4 separate times over the course of that exchange, each one dissolving somewhere between intention and air. The men had paid out with the straight faces of a Supreme Court. What none of them put in the notes app, what none of them said aloud, because to say it aloud would have required acknowledging something larger than any of them were prepared to process, was that the stuttering wasn't the interesting part. The interesting part was what happened to his eyes every time she walked into a room. But that was a different tally entirely. It began with an observation that nobody in the history of the Kwon syndicate had ever been brave enough to make. Phi made it on a Tuesday, in broad daylight, without lowering her voice. She had been restocking the east sitting room when Hyuk passed through on his way to a morning briefing, suit sharp, posture immaculate, carrying the specific atmospheric weight that made his men instinctively straighten when he entered their peripheral vision. He looked, as he always looked, formidable. Constructed. A man assembled entirely from consequence. Phi looked up from the shelf she was organizing, studied his face for a moment with the calm, diagnostic attention of someone who had grown up watching her mother assess patients in a hospital corridor, and said, "You know that glare isn't actually scary, right? That's just tired eyes. Honey, when did you last sleep?" The briefing room, 6 feet down the hall, went completely silent. Hyuk stopped walking. That is not, this is simply how my undereye bags," Phi said, not unkindly. "Significant ones. And your skin is dehydrated. You're probably drinking all that water and none of it is staying anywhere useful." She tilted her head. "Do you have a skincare routine?" The silence from the briefing room deepened into something that could only be described as collective suspended animation. Hyuk's expression moved through several territories before settling on something that was attempting to be authority but kept getting rerouted. "I wash my face," he said, with the dignity of a man who understood he was losing ground but intended to lose it standing up. "With what?" A pause that lasted precisely long enough to confirm the answer was soap. Phi nodded slowly, the way you nod when a situation has revealed itself to be exactly as serious as you suspected. "Give me 20 minutes, she said. "Tonight, after 9. He showed up at 9:14. Phi chose to interpret this as punctuality. She had arranged everything on the bathroom counter with the organized efficiency of someone who took the assignment seriously, 10 products in order of application, each one explained before it was applied, no shortcuts taken. Hyuk sat on the edge of the counter stool and submitted to this process with the expression of a man determined to maintain his dignity through an experience that was systematically dismantling it. He held himself with the same precise stillness he brought to hostile negotiations, which Phi found both admirable and genuinely funny, though she kept that last part to herself. "This one's a cleanser," she said. "Not soap. There's a difference." She applied it with the efficient, no-nonsense hands of someone who had been doing her grandmother's skincare since she was 15. "Close your eyes." He closed his eyes. It was, Min Jae would later reflect when he heard the account secondhand from the guard stationed outside the door, probably the only instruction Kwon Hyuk had followed without a demonstrated power dynamic in the last 6 years. By step 4, a serum that Phi described as non-negotiable, the rigid set of his shoulders had dropped approximately 2 degrees. By step 7, he had stopped gripping the counter edge. By step 10, a moisturizer applied with the firm, practiced movements of genuine care, his face had arrived somewhere it possibly hadn't been in years. Still. Quiet. Without the weight behind it. Not the stillness of a weapon. Just a man, sitting somewhere safe, being taken care of by someone who hadn't asked anything from him in return. Phi handed him the small mirror. He looked at his own reflection for a long moment. The under-eye shadows, not gone, but softened. His face, for once, carrying something other than controlled severity. He didn't stutter. He just said, very quietly, "It's different." "That's your face," Phi said simply, capping the moisturizer. "Without all the armor on it." She said it like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. For him, it was anything but. The memo was distributed on a Wednesday morning. Not a digital notification. Not a casual verbal instruction passed down through the chain of command. An actual printed document, placed on the desk of every senior member of the household staff and relevant syndicate personnel, formatted with the same clean, unsparing precision that Hyuk applied to operational directives worth millions of won. It was 4 sentences long. Effective immediately, the term honey is prohibited within the penthouse premises. This applies to all staff, personnel, and contracted individuals operating within this residence. Compliance is expected without exception. K.H. Min Jae had read it 3 times. Then he had set it down carefully, in the manner of a man handling something that required a certain delicacy, and stared at his office wall for approximately 90 seconds processing the fact that his employer, the man whose documented achievements in psychological warfare occupied a dedicated page in a private notes application, had just issued a formal decree about a term of endearment. He did not add it to the notes app. Some things existed beyond the reach of documentation. Phi received her copy at 9:15. She read it at the kitchen counter over her morning coffee. Her expression moved through something thoughtful, something amused, and then arrived at the particular settled look of a woman who had just been handed a problem she already knew the solution to. She finished her coffee, rinsed the cup, and went about her morning. Hyuk passed through the main corridor at 10:40, flanked by 2 members of his inner circle, mid-conversation about a logistics arrangement that required his full attention. Important. Consequential. The kind of operational discussion that had no room in it for disruption. Phi was coming the other direction with fresh towels. She looked up, noted him, and smiled with the warm, unhurried ease of a woman who had read the memo thoroughly and made her peace with it completely. "Morning, sweetie," she said. "You eat breakfast today?" The logistics discussion stopped. Hyuk's stride stuttered before his voice did. This morning he reset. Tried again. Got as far as this once more before the sentence dissolved entirely into something that technically contained consonants but no communicable meaning. Phi waited with the patience of deep water. His 2 associates studied the ceiling with synchronized intensity. "Good," Phi said, as though he had answered coherently. She continued past him down the corridor. "There's rice on the stove if you haven't." By Thursday, he had adjusted the memo. The following terms are additionally prohibited within the penthouse premises: sweetie, sugar, darling, and all derivative variations thereof. Phi read the updated version at the kitchen counter with the same morning coffee ritual. This time the thoughtful part was shorter. The amused part was longer. The settled look arrived faster. By Friday afternoon, she had rotated through Pumpkin, which produced a stutter of such sustained architectural complexity that Sung-ho, stationed at the far end of the corridor, had to briefly face the wall. Dear Heart on Saturday morning caused Hyuk to set down a signed document, pick it up, set it down again, and leave the room at a pace that was almost but not quite a retreat. Baby on Sunday, deployed once, gently, when she handed him his tea, resulted in a full 30-second silence in which the word "I" was attempted on 4 separate occasions before being mercifully abandoned. The Notes app gained 3 new entries. The memo gained 7 new prohibited terms by the following Wednesday, each addition representing a small, precise defeat that nobody in the penthouse was going to acknowledge out loud. What everyone understood, without requiring it to be stated, was the fundamental problem with Hyuk's strategy. He was trying to legislate warmth. And Phi had an unlimited vocabulary. It was 12 past midnight when Hyuk walked into the kitchen and found the lights already on. Phi was at the island, both hands wrapped around a mug, not reading anything, not on her phone, simply sitting in the particular quality of late-night quiet that belongs to people comfortable enough in their own company to require nothing from it. She looked up when he entered, registered him without surprise, and nodded toward the kettle on the stove the way you direct someone to something that was already theirs. He poured himself tea. He sat down across from her. Neither of them spoke immediately, and the silence between them was different from every other silence in the penthouse, lighter, somehow. Unweighted. The kind that didn't ask anything from you. It was Hyuk who broke it. My father gave me this name because it means strength, he said, without preamble, without the careful architecture he usually constructed around anything personal. He said a man named Hyuk would never be questioned. He turned the mug slowly in both hands. He was right. Nobody questions the name. They question nothing. They only move away from it. Phi listened the way she always listened, fully, without interruption, giving his words the respect of actual space to land in. That is a very lonely kind of power, she said. He didn't deny it. That alone was significant, the absence of the reflexive deflection that heavily armored men reached for when something arrived too accurately. He simply looked at the mug and said, quietly, yes. Phi turned her own cup in a slow circle. My grandmother named me Seraphina because she said it meant fire and light together. Said you don't get one without the other. A small pause. I was a difficult child. Argued everything. Had opinions about things a 7-year-old has no business having opinions about. The corner of her mouth lifted. She never once told me to be quieter. She said the world would try to do that well enough on its own. My job was just to keep the fire. Hyuk watched her face while she spoke, not with the evaluating attention he gave people he was measuring for threat or value, but with something slower and more unguarded. The look of a person encountering a frequency they hadn't known existed and finding it, against all prior experience, clarifying. She sounds formidable, he said. She's the most powerful person I've ever known, Phi said. And she has never once made anyone afraid of her. The kitchen held that statement for a long moment without comment. Hyuk looked at the marble countertop. When he looked back up, something in his expression had shifted, not all the way toward vulnerability, but toward the threshold of it. Close enough to matter. I have never known how to be powerful that way, he said. I know, Phi said. Simply, without judgment, without making him feel the weight of the admission. That's why you're still sitting here at midnight instead of sleeping. He almost smiled. It didn't quite complete itself, but it traveled further than most things did on that face. They sat together until nearly 2, talking with the unhurried ease of people who had silently agreed the night had enough room for honesty. No titles between them. No protocols. No memos with prohibited vocabulary. Just a man learning, slowly and without fanfare, what it felt like to be heard by someone who wanted nothing from him in return. And a woman who had always understood that this exact thing, a quiet kitchen, 2 cups of tea, the city asleep outside the windows, was the most important work there was. He didn't stutter once. Not a single time. The quarterly strategy meeting convened at 11 sharp. 12 men around a long obsidian table, senior syndicate members, regional advisors, 2 men whose official titles existed purely for the comfort of legal documentation. The average age was 54. The combined institutional memory stretched back through 3 decades of Seoul's underworld, through regime changes and territorial wars and the kinds of negotiations that never appeared in any public record. These were not men who were easily unsettled. They understood the room they were sitting in. They understood who sat at the head of it. Hyuk had opened the meeting with the precise, low-voiced authority that made people write things down rather than trust their own memory. The matter under discussion was a Northern Territory restructure, competing legacy agreements, fractured alliances, the kind of multi-layered operational negotiation that demanded absolute concentration and the full, uninterrupted gravity of everyone present. It had been running 40 minutes. It was approaching its most delicate point. Elder Choi, the most senior man in the room, was midway through a position statement that had taken him 30 years of experience to be qualified to deliver. The door opened. Not urgently. Not dramatically. It opened with the same practical, purposeful energy with which Phi approached most things, the energy of someone who had somewhere to be and a clear reason for being there. She came through carrying a lunchbox in one hand and a small insulated flask in the other, and she did not slow down upon encountering 12 faces swiveling toward her with expressions spanning disbelief, alarm, and one that could only be described as existential confusion. She located Hyuk at the head of the table, walked the length of the room with the straight, unhurried trajectory of a woman on a simple errand, and set the lunchbox down beside his notepad with a small, definitive sound. "You left this on the kitchen counter," she said. "I know you've got the protein shake in the fridge, but we've had that conversation and I think we both know how it ends." She unclipped the flask and set it beside the box. Green tea. Still hot. She became aware, in the way that a person becomes aware of weather, of the quality of silence surrounding her. 12 men. 0 movement. The particular suspended stillness of a room that had collectively stopped breathing. She glanced briefly, pleasantly, at Elder Choi. Then at the room in general, with the equanimity of a woman who had grown up in Brooklyn and was not, therefore, easily pressured by atmosphere. Then back to Hyuk. Eat when you get a break, sugar plum. She left. The door closed with a quiet, final click behind her. The boardroom did not immediately resume. Elder Choi sat with his position statement paused at its most consequential juncture. The men to Hyuk's left, who had survived 4 rival administrations and 1 government investigation without changing his expression, stared at the closed door as though it had said something he needed more time to process. Across the table, a regional advisor had stopped writing mid-sentence, pen still touching paper, and appeared to have no immediate plans to continue. Hyuk sat very still. The lunchbox occupied the space beside his notepad with the serene, immovable confidence of something that belonged there. The northern restructure, he said, after a silence that lasted precisely long enough to confirm that nobody in the room was going to address what had just happened, will proceed as outlined in the revised agreement. His voice was level. Authoritative. Exactly as it always was. Except that Min Jae, seated 2 chairs down, noticed his jaw was working slightly harder than usual. And that he uncapped the flask almost immediately. The meeting continued for another 2 hours. Business was conducted. Decisions were reached. The northern restructure was resolved with a precision that 3 of the 12 men would privately describe as some of Hyuk's best strategic work. He ate every bite of the lunch. Nobody mentioned it. 3 men made private notes on the drive home, about the lunchbox, about the flask, about the word that had landed in the middle of a room full of dangerous, serious men and simply sat there, warm and completely unafraid. Sugar Plum. Seoul's most feared criminal organization, and not one of them had known what to do with it. The intelligence came in at 2 a.m. on a Friday. Min Jae received it first, a single encrypted message from a contact embedded in the Seoul faction, a rival organization that had spent the better part of 18 months watching the Kwon syndicate for any available fracture point. The message was brief. Operational. The kind that didn't require interpretation. They've been watching the penthouse. They think he's compromised. They're moving tonight. Min Jae read it twice, put on his jacket, and picked up his phone. The CO faction had done their arithmetic carefully, which was the one thing you could say in their favor. They had observed the changes. The kitchen with its new smells. The guards who no longer maintained their assigned posts with military rigidity because something on the stove kept pulling them toward the island. The boss who arrived at external meetings slightly later than his established pattern, who had been seen, by a paid observer in a building across the street, standing in a corridor talking to a woman in a hospitality uniform for lengths of time that had no operational explanation. They had compiled these observations into a theory, and the theory was this: Kwon Hyuk had gone soft. It was, as theories go, both completely understandable and catastrophically wrong. They moved on the penthouse at 3:15. What they had not accounted for, what their careful arithmetic had failed entirely to include, was that the changes in the Kwon syndicate's atmosphere had not replaced its infrastructure. The guards who drifted toward the kitchen still maintained every external protocol. The surveillance architecture of the building was the same. The response chain, when triggered, operated with the same speed and precision it always had. The only thing that had changed was the men at the center of it. And they had fundamentally misread what that change meant. Phi was in the east corridor when the building's emergency protocol activated, a low, specific tone that she hadn't heard before but understood immediately, the way you understand certain sounds without needing them explained. She stopped. Stayed still. Assessed. Hyuk came around the corner 30 seconds later, moving with a speed and directness that was entirely different from his usual controlled pace, flanked by Min Jae and 2 others. He saw her. Something crossed his face, fast, complex, and more honest than anything his boardroom expression had ever produced. "Stay here," he said. No stutter. Completely clean. The voice of a man who had returned to a register he knew absolutely. "Tell me what's happening," Phi said, because she was not a woman who accepted instructions without context. "The east stairwell is sealed. This corridor is the safest point in the building until my men have resolved the lower floors." He looked at her directly. "I need you to trust me for the next 20 minutes. Phi looked at his face. Not the constructed, armored version. The midnight kitchen version, present, unguarded, asking her something real. "Okay," she said. He held her gaze for one moment longer than was strictly operational. Then he moved. What happened on the lower floors took 14 minutes. Min-jae would document it later with the careful, factual language he applied to all official records, but what the language didn't fully capture was the particular quality of what Hyuk brought to those 14 minutes. It wasn't the cold, architectural violence of his earlier years, the kind that operated at a remove, behind a wall of engineered composure. It was something more direct. More human and therefore, paradoxically, more frightening. The fury of a man who had recently discovered he had something worth protecting and was not interested in negotiating with anyone who threatened it. The CO faction had expected a distracted man. They found the opposite. It was, as Elder Choi observed quietly to Min-jae afterward, the most dangerous version of the boss either of them had ever seen. Not because he was cold. Because this time, he wasn't. The building was quiet by 4:30. The kind of quiet that follows something serious, not peaceful exactly, but settled. Resolved. The quiet of a storm that has passed and left the air behind it clean and very still. Phi was where he had left her, sitting on the low bench in the east corridor with her hands in her lap and her back straight, because she was not a woman who waited for things in a diminished posture. She looked up when she heard his footsteps. Scanned him, the practiced, instinctive assessment of someone who had grown up watching her mother check people for what they weren't saying, and whatever she found in his face made her exhale slowly through her nose. "You're not hurt," she said. Not a question. "No," he said. She nodded. Moved along the bench. The gesture was so simple and so clear, "Sit down," that he sat without deliberating, which was itself a thing that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had known him 3 months ago. They sat side by side in the corridor, the white marble walls holding the last hour's residue of tension, the city outside doing whatever the city did at 4:30 in the morning, indifferent and continuous. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then Hyuk said, "I need to tell you something." Phi waited. He opened his mouth. What came out was, "I." And then nothing. The word stood alone in the corridor like a man who had arrived at the right address and forgotten why he came. He tried again. The thing is that he stopped. Set his hands on his knees with the deliberate, grounding pressure of a man trying to locate solid earth. There is something that Phi did not fill the silence. Did not rescue him from it or move around it or make it easier in any way that would have let him off the hook. She simply sat beside him, present and unhurried, the way she had stood in the hallway on that very first morning with a tray of tea and all the time in the world. Giving him the space to find it. Trusting that he would. He exhaled. Tried a different entry point. Since that one dissolved too, somewhere between intention and air. He looked at the floor. Then the wall. Then, with the expression of a man who had dismantled organizations and survived decades of warfare and was now being genuinely defeated by the grammatical structure of a feeling, at his own hands. "Take your time," Phi said quietly. "I have been taking my time," he said, with a frustration so nakedly human that it almost made her smile. "I have been taking approximately," he checked his watch, 9 minutes. "You've got one more," she said. "Come." Certain. The way his grandmother might have said it, he thought, if he had been lucky enough to have a grandmother like hers. He looked at her then. Really looked. The way he had been learning to look at things since midnight conversations and skincare routines and lunchboxes left on kitchen counters had slowly, without his permission, taught him that some things deserved your full and unguarded attention. He breathed in. "I love you," he said. 3 words. Clean. Complete. No stutter, no dissolution, no abandoned sentence left standing in the corridor. Just the words, arrived at last, after 10 minutes and 3 months and 34 years of not knowing how to let anything through. Phi looked at him for a long moment. That look, the knowing, unhurried, "I see exactly who you are" look that had started all of this in a hallway with a tray of tea. Then she said, with the quiet warmth of a woman who had known for some time, "I know, honey." He didn't stutter. He laughed. It was small, and briefly startled, and entirely real, the laugh of a man encountering something in himself he hadn't known was still there. It lasted only a moment. But Min-jae, passing the corridor entrance on a routine post-incident check, heard it, stopped walking, and stood very still. In 6 years, he had never heard that sound before. He added nothing to the notes app. Some things didn't belong in a record. Some things you just carried quietly, like something rare that the night had given you, and you didn't speak of it because speaking of it might make it smaller than it was. He continued down the corridor. Behind him, the bench held two people sitting in the particular silence of something that had finally, after a long journey, arrived exactly where it was always going. 3 months after the night of the CO faction's catastrophic miscalculation, a journalist writing an unauthorized profile of the Kwon syndicate interviewed 11 people who had encountered Hyuk at various points in his career. She was looking for a pattern. She found one. Every single person she spoke to used the same word, unprompted, to describe the experience of being in his presence. Cold. She never finished the profile. The story she had gone looking for turned out to be a different story entirely, and she didn't have the framework for it yet. She filed her notes and moved on to something else. Some things resist the shape of the narrative you bring to them. They require you to build a new one. The penthouse changed in the way that spaces change when the person living in them changes, gradually, then all at once, so that one morning you look around and realize the evidence has been accumulating for longer than you noticed. There was color now. Not much. Hyuk was not a man who overcorrected, but a throw across the reading chair in a deep rust that Phi had selected and he had not removed. A plant on the kitchen windowsill that she had installed without announcement and that had, against reasonable expectation, survived. A second mug that lived beside his on the shelf, because somewhere along the way it had simply begun to belong there. The skincare products occupied a dedicated shelf in the bathroom. The prohibited terms memo, all 7 revised iterations of it, had been quietly removed from circulation sometime in the weeks following the corridor bench at 4:30 in the morning. Nobody acknowledged its absence. Nobody needed to. The notes app still existed. Min Jae had not deleted it. He had, however, stopped updating the stutter tally sometime in the weeks following the CO incident, not because the stuttering had entirely ceased, but because the context of it had changed into something that no longer felt like data worth collecting. It had become, instead, something private. Something that belonged to two people and the specific geography between them. What Phi had done, and she would have been the first to resist the framing of it as something she had done, because in her understanding she had simply been herself, fully and without apology, was refuse a story. Not loudly. Not as an act of deliberate intervention. She had simply walked into a building where everyone had agreed on what a particular man was, and she had looked at him and seen something the agreement had left out. She had seen the underi bags behind the menacing glare. The empty kitchen behind the invincible empire. The man trying to say how dare you who couldn't get past the letter H because something in him recognized, before his mind caught up, that he was being seen for the first time in longer than he could account for. Labels are efficient. They organize the world into navigable categories and save the brain the work of reassessment. Boss. Maid. Monster. King. Clean lines, clear hierarchies, everyone in their designated position. The problem with labels is the same problem with those gleaming kitchen appliances that had never been asked to do the thing they existed for. They look complete. They function as decoration. And the life they were meant to contain, the actual, complicated, redeemable life, goes unlived inside them. Phi had not arrived in Seoul to dismantle a criminal empire. She had arrived to do her job, drink good tea, and treat every soul she encountered as worthy of basic human warmth until proven otherwise. That was the whole philosophy. It fit in a sentence. Her grandmother had given it to her for free. And what it had produced, in a white marble hallway, on an ordinary Wednesday, with a silver tray and a single word, was a man who remembered he was one. Hyuk still ran the syndicate. That didn't change. The infrastructure of his authority remained intact, the respect of his men undisturbed, the city's quiet understanding of what his name meant continuing without revision. What changed was what he did with the silence. It was still his most powerful tool. But it was no longer his only one. He had learned, slowly and without grace and at considerable personal cost, that there was a kind of strength that didn't require the removal of feeling. That composure and tenderness were not opposites. That the man who had made a Hong Kong representative weep with 4 minutes of stillness was also capable of sitting on a bench at 4:30 in the morning and saying 3 words that had taken him his entire life to reach. Both things were true. Both things were him. That was the lesson. Not delivered from a distance, not extracted from a parable or a proverb or the careful language of a self-improvement framework. Delivered in a penthouse kitchen at midnight, over 2 cups of tea, by a woman from Brooklyn who had never once considered being afraid of him. True strength is not the absence of emotion. It is the courage, the specific, hard-won, daily courage, to let it be seen. The Glacial King had not been defeated. He had been opened. And what came through, once the ice finally moved, was not weakness. It was everything he had been protecting all along. Thank you for watching Mafia Moonlight Tales. If this story found you somewhere real, like, subscribe, share it with someone who needs it, and drop a comment below. We'll see you at the next one.